of damaging findings of the third Robert Owen. Thank you very much.
And that was Alexander Litvinenko's widow, Marina, speaking a few moments after the results of that inquiry were released here in London. Let's go live to Moscow now and talk to our correspondent there, Sarah Rainsford. Any official reaction to that top line from the inquiry that President Putin probably was involved?
Not an official reaction as such. We are expecting to hear from the Foreign Ministry in a short time, but we have seen comments from one of the key suspects, Andrei Lugovoy. He's been speaking to Interfax in the last few minutes, and he's dismissed the allegations coming out of that conclusion to the inquiry as absurd. He said, as expected, there was absolutely no sensation from this inquiry, and saying that it simply confirms the anti-Russian position of London, the anti-Russian hysteria, as he called it, and a lack of desire to hear the truth about what happened to Alexander Litvinenko. Now, bear in mind that Andrei Lugovoy, the key suspect, as I say, in all of this, has said all along he has nothing to do with it, despite that trail of the radioactive isotope that led very clearly between him, the victim, and back here to Moscow. And he and others here in Russia have all along tried to paint the inquiry as an anti-Russian act, part of an information war, and all of it in the context of the real difficulties in relations between Russia and the West in the last few years, particularly since what happened in Ukraine.
And so the British authorities have always said that they have enough evidence to charge Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun, but Russia a few years ago refused to extradite, and presumably that will stick. They will not extradite him even after what we've heard today.
No, I think it's extremely unlikely, if not impossible, that Russia would now do an about-turn and send Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun back to London to face trial for what they're accused of doing. Certainly, Mr. Putin has said in the past that that would be against Russia's constitution. Russia doesn't extradite people in that way. Also, bear in mind that Andrei Lugovoy has been given a medal for his services to the country. That was because of his work as an MP. He's become a member of Parliament here, we're told, but the timing was highly curious, to say the least. Dmitry Kovtun is also living as a free man here in Russia. These people are certainly not seen as those who ought to be handed over to justice. And as for the accusation or suggestion that Mr. Putin probably ordered this killing, well, I think Russia will certainly latch on to the word probably and demand to see proper proof of that. And over the past months and years, we've seen Russia shrug off all sorts of accusations. I expect the same this time. The question is how strongly Russia responds, and that will very much depend on exactly what kind of sanctions, if any, come from the UK.
And Sarah, is there a bigger picture at play here? I mean, relations between Britain and Russia have suffered over this case, but I'm just thinking of, for example, the conflict in Syria. I just wonder whether both sides may not want this to make those relations much worse, given other issues at stake.
I think it's a difficult balancing act, certainly. I think there's a sense that there is, outside of this particular issue, this scandal, if you like, there is a sense that Russia and the West could be finding some common ground in terms of their common enemy in Syria, the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, and its militants, and that it might be time for Russia and the West to re-engage. In terms of the UK particularly, that these findings, of course, do complicate that. I think David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, will be under a lot of pressure to respond to this in necessary form, if you like. But the Foreign Office, we understand, has been cautioning against extra sanctions, certainly concerned about seeing the relationship, the engagement with Russia suffer even more, particularly, as you said, at a time when perhaps everyone would benefit from more engagement with Russia over Syria. Many people, though, do dispute that point of view. And as you heard from Mr. Litvinenko's widow, there are calls for strong sanctions to be implemented.
Sarah, many thanks. The BBC Sarah Rainsford live for us in Moscow. Now, let's just recap our main story this hour before we go. An independent inquiry in Britain has found that the former Russian spy, Alexander Litvinenko, was assassinated by the Russian Secret Service in an operation that was probably approved by President Vladimir Putin. Mr. Litvinenko was poisoned with radioactive polonium in London. That was back in 2006. Well, in its report, the inquiry pointed to a number of reasons why those within the Russian state would have targeted Mr. Litvinenko. These included his disclosures about the activities of the Secret Service, or FSB, before he left Russia, his relationship with British intelligence, and a personal antagonism between himself and Mr. Putin.
Hello, welcome to World Business Report. Before we get on to the business, we do have some breaking news to bring you. A British inquiry, as you know, has concluded that Russian President Vladimir Putin probably approved a Secret Service operation to kill former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. Let's hear what the inquiry chairman, Sir Robert Owen, said in a public statement. This is just a few minutes ago.
2006, in University College Hospital, London, by then a British citizen. Post-mortem examination revealed that his death had been caused by an ingestion of a fatal dose of the radioisotope polonium-210. The circumstances of his death attracted worldwide interest and concern. They were referred to by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee as, and I quote, a miniature nuclear attack on the streets of London. In July 2007, the then Foreign Secretary observed that, and I quote, the manner of Litvinenko's death put many hundreds of other people at risk. A motion of the United States House of Representatives, dated the 1st of April 2008, noted that polonium-210, and I quote, could be used to kill large numbers of people or spread general panic and hysteria among the public. In the course of the inquest hearings, it was submitted on behalf of media organizations that the issues to which it gave rise, I quote, include allegations of state-sponsored assassination by radioactive poisoning of a British citizen in London, issues of the greatest public concern. Over 9 years have elapsed since his death, and it is appropriate that I should explain shortly why it has taken so long for a full inquiry into his death to be completed. The inquest into his death was opened by Her Majesty's Coroner for Inner North London, on the 30th of November 2006, but was adjourned pending the police investigation into his death and any ensuing criminal proceedings. The police investigation led to the conclusion that the fatal dose of polonium-210 was probably consumed by Mr. Litvinenko on the 1st of November 2006, when in the company of Mr. Andrei Lugovoy and Mr. Dmitry Kovtun, Russian nationals, at a hotel in London. Warrants were in due course issued for their arrest, and the Crown Prosecution Service sought, unsuccessfully, to extradite them from the Russian Federation to stand trial for murder. On the 13th of October 2011, the inquest was resumed, as it had become clear by then that there was no realistic prospect of the suspects facing a criminal trial. And on the 7th of August 2012, I was appointed to conduct the inquest. In the course of my preparation for the inquest, I was given access to sensitive government documents that in my judgment were relevant to the investigation that I was conducting. More particularly, those documents raised a prima facie case that the Russian state bore responsibility for Mr. Litvinenko's death. The law does not permit evidence to be taken in what are known as secret or closed sessions at an inquest. But the government material was of such sensitivity that it could not be produced in any form of public or open hearing. The material was therefore necessarily excluded from the inquest proceedings under the legal principle known as public interest immunity. It had always been my view that the question of possible Russian state responsibility was one of the most important issues arising from his death. It was an issue that I had wanted to investigate at the inquest, but I considered that I would be failing in my duty to conduct a full and independent investigation if I did so in the knowledge that there was relevant government material that I could not take into account because of public interest immunity. I therefore wrote to Her Majesty's government asking it to exercise the power to establish a public inquiry to replace the inquest. I did so because under Section 1.1 of the Inquiries Act 2005, that power may be exercised where it appears to a minister that, as I quote, particular events have caused or are capable of causing public concern, or there is public concern that particular events may have occurred. The advantage of a public inquiry over an inquest was that the rules governing an inquiry allow for sensitive evidence to be heard in closed session. However, the Home Secretary declined my request, but her refusal to establish a public inquiry was successfully challenged in the High Court by Mr. Litvinenko's widow, Marina Litvinenko. The judgment in which the Divisional Court upheld the challenge was handed down on the 11th of February 2014. It required the Home Secretary to make a further decision as to whether to establish an inquiry. Thus, on the 22nd of July 2014, almost 2 years after I had been appointed to conduct the inquest, the Home Secretary announced in a written statement laid before the House of Commons that a public inquiry was to be held into the death of Alexander Litvinenko under the Inquiries Act 2005, and in consequence the inquest was suspended. I was appointed to chair the inquiry. I was then a serving judge of the High Court, an office from which I retired on the 19th of September 2014, having reached the compulsory retirement age. But my retirement did not affect my position as chairman of the inquiry. The terms of reference for the inquiry, terms upon which I was consulted, are set out in full in my report and on the inquiry website. Paragraph 1 provides as follows. Subject to paragraphs 2 and 3 below, the chairman is to conduct an investigation into the death of Alexander Litvinenko in order to, 1, ascertain, in accordance with Section 5.1 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, who the deceased was, how, when, and where he came by his death, and the particulars required by the Births and Deaths Registration Act 1953 to be registered concerning his death. And 2, to identify, so far as is consistent with Section 2 of the Inquiries Act, where responsibility for the death lies. 3, to make such recommendations as may be appropriate. By her letter of appointment, the Home Secretary invited me to complete the inquiry by December 2015. I opened the inquiry on the 31st of July 2014. The final open hearing took place a year to the day later, on the 31st of July 2015. On the 15th of December last, I announced that my report was complete. and that in accordance with the protocol agreed with the Secretary of State, the report would be delivered to her 48 hours before being tabled by her in the House of Commons at 9:35 today. It will shortly be published on the inquiry website. The inquiry has been completed well within the budget prepared by the Inquiry Secretariat and adopted by the Home Secretary in setting a budget cap. I conducted open hearings at the Royal Courts of Justice on 34 days in January, February, March and July 2015. The open evidence is available to the public in its entirety on the inquiry website. The oral evidence in the form of full daily transcripts. The witness statements and the documents admitted into evidence are also available on the website. I also held closed hearings in the course of which I heard oral evidence and considered a documentary material the subject of restriction notices. The findings of fact and the conclusions that I have drawn from the facts are based upon the entirety of the evidence that I have seen and heard, both open and closed. They are mine and mine alone. I turn then shortly to summarize the essential findings of fact and my conclusions as to how, when and where Alexander Litvinenko came by his death, and as to where responsibility for that death lies. Alexander Litvinenko was born on the 4th of December 1962 in the Russian city of Voronezh. He attended military college, graduating in about 1985 as a lieutenant, and served for approximately 3 years in the forces of the Interior Ministry. In 1988, he was recruited to join what was then still called the KGB, and in 1991 was posted to KGB headquarters in Moscow. In September 2000, he left Russia in the circumstances that I consider in detail in part 3 of my report. On the 1st of November 2000, he arrived in London with his wife Marina and son Anatoly, where in the transit area of London Airport he approached the first police officer that he saw and said, "I am a KGB officer and I'm asking for political asylum." He was granted asylum in due course, and on the 13th of October 2006, he and his family were granted British citizenship. 41 days later, Alexander Litvinenko died at University College Hospital, London. The immediate cause of death was a cardiac arrest from which the medical staff at the hospital were unable to resuscitate him. But the cardiac arrest was the result of an acute radiation syndrome caused by his having ingested approximately 4.4 gigabecquerel of polonium-210. The evidence indicates that there was more than one intake of polonium-210. The second and fatal ingestion occurred on the 1st of November 2006, the 6th anniversary of his arrival in the United Kingdom seeking asylum. The first, which had been about 1/100th of the size, It occurred some 14 days earlier. The evidence establishes that Mr. Litvinenko ingested the fatal dose whilst drinking tea from a teapot contaminated with polonium-210 in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel in the West End of London on the afternoon of the 1st of November, in the company of Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. I am sure that Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun placed the polonium-210 into the teapot at the Pine Bar and did so with the intention of poisoning Mr. Litvinenko. I am also sure that the two men made the earlier attempt to poison Mr. Litvinenko, also using polonium-210, at a meeting on the 16th of October 2006. I am sure that Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun knew that they were using a deadly poison and that they intended to kill Mr. Litvinenko. I do not, however, believe that they knew precisely what the chemical that they were handling was or the nature of all its properties. Mr. Litvinenko did not, as has been suggested by Mr. Lugovoy and those representing him in the early stages of the inquest proceedings, and by other commentators, poisoned himself with polonium-210, either accidentally or deliberately. The scientific evidence as to the sites of primary contamination by polonium-210, detailed in Part 6 of my report, demonstrates conclusively that Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. The further suggestion that has been made by Mr. Lugovoy that he had been the subject of a setup is simply unsustainable by reference to the objective scientific evidence. There can be no doubt that Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun. The open evidence upon which I have arrived at that conclusion is set out in considerable detail in parts 4, 5, 6, and 8 of the report. My finding that Mr. Litvinenko was poisoned by Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun raises a further question. There is no evidence to suggest that either had any personal reason to kill Mr. Litvinenko. All the evidence points in one direction, namely that then when they killed Mr. Litvinenko, they were acting on behalf of someone else. I have concluded that there is a strong probability that when Mr. Lugovoy poisoned Mr. Litvinenko, he did so under the direction of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. I have further concluded that Mr. Kovtun was also acting under FSB direction, possibly indirectly through Mr. Lugovoy, but probably in the knowledge that that was the body for which he was acting. I have further concluded that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin. These findings relating to Russian state responsibility are based on evidence which I heard in open and closed sessions of the inquiry. My reasoning for these conclusions in open is to be found in parts 9 and 10 of the report. That concludes my short summary of the inquiry's core findings. I should note at this point that despite the welter of public comment and speculation since November 2006, there has not until now been a formal and independent investigation tasked with inquiring into and making findings about the circumstances of Mr. Litvinenko's death. Our law requires that all violent or unnatural deaths are investigated in this way. Had Mr. Lugovoy or Mr. Kovtun been put on trial in this country for Mr. Litvinenko's murder, those proceedings may well have satisfied this requirement. But for the reasons that I have explained, there have been no such criminal proceedings. The requirement for a formal investigation into Mr. Litvinenko's death was therefore outstanding, with the additional advantage over and above the evidence that an inquest or criminal trial would have been able to consider of having been able to examine sensitive evidence in the closed sessions. That is the function that I have now fulfilled. As I have explained, the inquest into the death of Alexander Litvinenko was suspended when my inquiry was established. I am not currently minded to reopen the inquest, as I have addressed all of the matters that I would have been obliged to consider as a coroner. Should any of the core participants wish for any reason to apply to me to reopen the inquest, they should communicate with the solicitor to the inquiry within 28 days, and I will make a decision as to whether there is sufficient reason to do so under paragraph 9.1 of the schedule of the Coroner and Justice Act 2009. It remains only for me to express my thanks to all who have assisted me in this inquiry, counsel and solicitor of the inquiry secretariat, the counsel and solicitors acting for the core participants, in particular, counsel and solicitor acting for Marina and Anatoly Litvinenko, to the Metropolitan Police, who carried out the original criminal investigation into the death of Alexander Litvinenko, an investigation exemplary in its breadth and in its depth, and to all of those who have facilitated the efficient running of the proceedings, in particular the teams responsible for the technical aspects of the inquiry hearing, including the simultaneous transcription of the evidence, and the team of ushers who assisted greatly in the management of the hearings. As I have already indicated, my report will shortly be available on the inquiry website in its entirety.
Oh, Sir Robert Owen, the judge leading the public inquiry into the death of Alexander Litvinenko, who died in 2006. And he said there can be no doubt that Mr. Litvinenko was poisoned by Mr. Andrei Lugovoy and Mr. Dmitry Kovtun on the 1st of November 2006 in the Millennium Hotel. And he's also added that the action had probably been approved by the head of the FSB, which is the Russian intelligence service, and by President Putin. Probably was the word he used. Strong possibility, he said, it was done under the instructions of the SSB and the intelligence service of the Russian Federation.
Russian President Vladimir Putin probably approved a Secret Service operation to kill former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. That's the conclusion of a British inquiry into his death by radioactive polonium poisoning. The report found it was likely that the two men who put polonium in his tea at a London hotel, Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy, were acting under the direction of the Russian Secret Service, overseen by Mr. Putin. Now, the inquiry judge, Sir Robert Owen, says there was personal antagonism between the Russian president and Mr. Litvinenko. He was speaking a short while ago and said he did not believe that Mr. Kovtun and Mr. Lugovoy had any personal grievance against their victim.
There is no evidence to suggest that either had any personal reason to kill Mr. Litvinenko. All the evidence points in one direction, namely that then when they killed Mr. Litvinenko, they were acting on behalf of someone else. I have concluded that there is a strong probability that when Mr. Lugovoy poisoned Mr. Litvinenko, he did so under the direction of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. I have further concluded that Mr. Kovtun was also acting under FSB direction, possibly indirectly through Mr. Lugovoy, but probably in the knowledge that that was the body for which he was acting. I have further concluded that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
That was Sir Robert Owen speaking just a short time ago. Well, let's take you to Alexander Litvinenko's wife, Marina. She is giving a press conference right now in central London. Let's listen in for her reaction.
The direction of others. The chairman found as a fact and to a high degree of probability that the FSB directed Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun to murder Sasha, and also found as a fact that both Vladimir Putin and Nikolai Patrushev, the director of the FSB at the time, personally approved the assassination. I'm, of course, very pleased that the words my husband spoke on his deathbed when he accused Mr. Putin of his murder have been proved. True, in the English court with the highest standards of independency and fairness. But now it's time for David Cameron. I'm calling immediately for the exclusion from the UK of all Russian intelligence operatives, whether from the FSB, who murdered Sasha, or from other Russian agencies based in the London embassy. I'm also calling for the imposition of targeted economic sanction and travel bans against named individuals, including Mr. Patrushev and Mr. Putin. I received a letter last night from the Home Secretary promising action. It's unthinkable that the Prime Minister would do nothing in the face of damning findings of Sir Robert Owen. Thank you.
So no question.
We have a big panel in front of you, and I would like to start with a huge grateful to all people who was with me with all this long journey. I'm absolutely amazed of all job was done by British Metropolitan Police. I have not represented here, but I would like to say it was always great job done. And of course, after we finish this public inquiry, I would like to say thank you very much to all this legal team and to all people who did this job to us. and of course to Sir Mr. Robert Owen, who provided this justice. I would like to present you to all people in this panel who I couldn't do anything without them. Of course, it's, you know, Ben Emerson, who was extremely helpful. It's just very easy to say. I couldn't do anything without his help and what job he provided. Of course, is my son Anatoly Litvinenko, who was only 12 when his father died. And it was not easy for him to step forward and started to talk to press, but I'm so proud of him, and I think I couldn't do it without him, what all happened for these last 2 years. His support was just extraordinary. And this, it's Yelena Tsirlina, it's solicitor, who maybe not was openly presented in a courtroom, but she extremely hard worker, and all job what he did, you can't just say how much it was helpful. Of course, is a very close friend of our family, Alex Goldfarb, who was from very beginning, and he knew exactly what happened to our family since 2000. And he was co-writer of our book, Death of Dissident. And he's an extraordinary expert of many things, and his evidence in the courtroom was crucial also. And of course, we have another presenter.
Alexander Litvinenko's widow, Marina, just thanking people who have helped her in the years since her husband was killed. She has spoken about the fact that she is pleased that the words her husband spoke on his deathbed, accusing President Putin, had actually been proved today in an English court. She asked for David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, to exclude all Russian intelligence agents from the UK. She asked for economic sanctions to be put on Russia, and also some travel bans to be put in place, including President Putin. As you can see, the media there are gathered. We'll take you back to this room in central London where Alexander Litvinenko's widow Marina is right now, if she takes questions from the media. But let's bring in our correspondent in Moscow, Oleg Boldarev, who is there for us watching all of this too. Oleg, what's been the official response in Moscow to the findings of this inquiry?
Not much, but in the words of the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, the purely criminal case was politicized and it was not transparent, and obviously Moscow regrets that things went that way. There's no surprises in her words, and such is a reaction in Moscow. Moscow was dismissive of the allegations, then the allegations, and now the conclusions of Litvinenko case. Obviously, Andrei Lugovoy, the main man accused of poisoning Alexander Litvinenko, is calling this absurd, and again says this is all to further some political goals by the British government.
I note the story, though, Oleg, is trending on Twitter at the moment in Russia. Is it getting any prominence on any of the mainstream media?
Obviously, the main TV channels are talking about this, again, in a slightly offhand way, dismissing. We think that the brunt of the reaction from Kremlin depends on whether the story will continue further from Downing Street now.
We are waiting for Britain's Home Secretary Theresa May, who will give the UK government's response to these findings to the House of Commons a little bit later. We'll learn more then. But Oleg, what are the potential impacts that we could see now on the relationship between Moscow and London?
Well, the relationship has been soured so long ago, and Moscow says it will watch the developments carefully. But in fact, it will remain to be seen what London considers fit to do. Obviously, the diplomats have been saying, unnamed diplomatic sources have been saying all along that Moscow is now valuable in the wider political context over Syria, that the contact with the Russian government needs to be kept. Whether this is going to lead to another breakdown in the relationship, we simply don't know. And now I think Kremlin is interested, just as we are, as to what the British government next step will be.
I mean, there are some specific calls. We've just heard from Mr. Litvinenko's widow, Marina, saying that she'd like some travel bans put in place, including on President Putin. That doesn't seem likely, but we possibly could see these growing calls for economic sanctions, do you think?
I think there's still some damage which London can inflict, given the popularity of this destination for many high-ranking businessmen or officials' families. Many of them are in UK. So if the retaliation is being taken along those lines, this will hurt. Again, economically, Russia is dismissive that any sanctions it has received over Ukraine affair has damaged the Russian economy. Oil and the sliding ruble, the ruble just crashed another low at the exchange, is a much bigger concern here. But obviously, steps by the UK government is still has still a lot of potential to hurt Moscow.
Remind us, Oleg, about what the possible motives could have been for Mr. Litvinenko being killed.
Well, Moscow all along was dismissive, calling Mr. Litvinenko a crank, calling him a opportunistic man who was trying to sell his services and his knowledge of how Russia's secret services operate, saying all along he was not in possession of anything serious. Obviously, all along there were calls to punish the traitor, and many Russian officials consider him a traitor. But this was then described as a more emotional reaction, not a call to direct action to assassinate him.
Oleg, thanks so much for joining us from Moscow. We're keeping across as well that press conference given by Alexander Litvinenko's widow, Marina. We'll bring you any news lines from that and bring you further reaction throughout the day here on BBC World News 2. Russian President Vladimir Putin probably approved a Secret Service operation to kill former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. That's the conclusion of a British inquiry into his death by radioactive polonium poisoning. The report found it was likely that these two men put polonium in his tea at a London hotel. Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy were acting under the direction of the Russian Secret Service, overseen by Mr. Putin. Now, the inquiry judge, Sir Robert Owen, says there was personal antagonism between the Russian president and Mr. Litvinenko. Speaking a short while ago, he said, though, he did not believe that Mr. Kovtun and Mr. Lugovoy had any personal grievance against their victim.
There is no evidence to suggest that either had any personal reason to kill Mr. Litvinenko. All the evidence points in one direction, namely that then when they killed Mr. Litvinenko, they were acting on behalf of someone else. I have concluded that there is a strong probability that when Mr. Lugovoy poisoned Mr. Litvinenko, he did so under the direction of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. I have further concluded that Mr. Kovtun was also acting under FSB direction, possibly indirectly through Mr. Lugovoy, but probably in the knowledge that that was the body for which he was acting. I have further concluded that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
With me here in the studio is the writer Edward Lucas, author of The New Cold War, also the former Moscow bureau chief for The Economist. Good to have you with us. What did you make of the findings?
I think this is a very tough report. It's much stronger than many people expected. It names Putin personally. It destroys the alternative theories that have been peddled by some of the Russian propagandists, that Mr. Litvinenko poisoned himself for some reason or was engaged in some nuclear smuggling detail. It makes it absolutely clear what happened and gives a very strong pointer as to why it happened. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the government to get round this without doing something pretty tough in response.
What are the British government's options now, given how tough the report was?
Well, I think that one thing is, what cooperation do we have with the Russian state on law enforcement generally? We already don't have any contacts with the FSB because we've known for ages that they had a hand in the murder. It's just been said publicly. But that, I think, police cooperation with Russia will be difficult in future. I would like to see Russian spies being chucked out of London. There are a great many of them here and they cause a lot of problems for MI5. We could be tougher on that. I would like to see us going after Russian dirty money in the City of London, where it swirls around between all those glitzy skyscrapers. And I'd also like to see a strong international diplomatic push against Russia.
Yeah, we've just seen Alexander Litvinenko's widow also calling for, as you mentioned, economic sanctions. Also, though, a travel ban. She wants to see President Putin banned too. Is that likely?
It's not likely, but it would be commendable. And I think one should just pay tribute here to this astonishing, dogged fight that Marina Litvinenko has engaged in since the death of her husband, which the British authorities at the time wanted to cover up. You know, there wasn't a proper inquiry. The secret evidence was kept very secret, and everybody was hoping back in 2006, 2007 that this would blow over. And yet what actually happened was a British citizen was killed with a radioactive weapon, endangering hundreds of other people. And I think it's absolutely terrific vindication for Marina Litvinenko to get this verdict after this inquiry.
Edward, the relationship right now, though, between Moscow and London is so fragile for a number of reasons. But the world is wanting, in many respects, there to be greater engagement with Russia right now over Syria. So how carefully will everyone be treading?
Well, I mean, the line from the Foreign Office is nothing we can do will bring Mr. Litvinenko back to life again, so let's just move on and try and get Russia to the Syrian peace talks. And I think that's a deplorable misunderstanding of what's going on. We're dealing with a rogue state here which goes around killing people. Mr. Litvinenko is far from the only person to have been murdered by the Kremlin. And I think we should be saying to the Russians, we've got your money here in London and you won't have it back unless you start behaving on Syria and other things.
We've already heard from the Russian Foreign Ministry. They've dismissed the inquiry. As we expected, they said it was biased and opaque. Will there be any more reaction that we can expect, or will they just push it aside?
Well, I mean, the Russian state wouldn't recognise independent judicial process if it landed on a spaceship in the middle of Red Square. It's completely foreign to them that you could have an independent inquiry of this kind. But I think that the astonishing thing to me really is that they try and deny it, as it's already part of Russian law that you can execute people for extremism. There have been plenty of other examples of critics of the Kremlin being killed abroad, and I don't know why they make such a fuss about it. I think they should just own up to it.
Well, we will wait and see what the response is from the Home Secretary, Theresa May. She's speaking in a few hours' time, and we'll bring you that here on BBC World News. Azi, thanks so much. We're going to take you straight to the House of Commons here in London, because the British Home Secretary, Theresa May, is giving the UK government's response to the findings into the death of the murder of former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko.
In this case, the threat posed by hostile states is one of the most sensitive issues that I deal with as Home Secretary. Although not often discussed in public, our security and intelligence agencies have always, dating back to the roots in the First and Second World Wars, had the protection of the UK from state threats at the heart of their mission. This means countering those threats in all their guises, whether from assassinations, cyber attacks, or more traditional espionage. By its nature, this work is both less visible and necessarily more secret than the police and the agency's work against the terrorist threat. But it is every bit as important to the long-term security and prosperity of the United Kingdom. The House will appreciate that I cannot go into detail about how we seek to protect ourselves from hostile state acts, but we make full use of the measures at our disposal, from investigatory powers right through to the visa system. And the case of Mr. Litvinenko demonstrates once again why it is so vital that the intelligence agencies maintain their ability to detect and disrupt such threats. The environment in which espionage and hostile states' intelligence activities take place is changing. Evolving foreign state interests and rapid technological advances mean it is imperative we respond. Last November, the Chancellor announced that we will make new funding available to the security and intelligence agencies to provide for an additional 1,900 officers, And in the same month, I published the draft Investigatory Powers Bill so that we can ensure that the intelligence agency's capabilities keep pace with the threat and technology, while at the same time improving the oversight of and safeguards for the use of investigatory powers. In the government's recently published National Security Strategy and the Strategic Defence and Security Review, we set out the range of threats to the UK and our allies, including from Russia, and our comprehensive approach to countering these threats. Since the publication of the previous SDSR in 2010, Russia has become more authoritarian, aggressive and nationalist. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its destabilising actions in Ukraine have directly challenged security in the region. These actions have also served as a sobering demonstration of Russia's intent to try to undermine European security and the rules-based international order. In response, the UK, in conjunction with international partners, has imposed a package of robust measures against Russia. This includes sanctions against key Russian individuals, including Mr. Patrushev, who is currently the Secretary to the Russian Security Council. The government is clear that we must protect the UK and her interests from Russia-based threats, working closely with our allies in the EU and NATO. And this morning I've written to my counterparts in EU, NATO and Five Eyes countries, drawing their attention to both the report and the need to take steps to prevent such a murder being committed on their streets. We will continue to call on President Putin for Russia, as one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, to engage responsibly and make a positive contribution to global security and stability. They can, for example, play an important role in defeating Daesh, and together with the wider international community help Syria work towards a stable future. We face some of the same challenges, from serious crime to aviation security, and we will continue to engage guardedly with Russia where it is strictly necessary to do so to support the UK's national interest. Mr. Speaker, Sir Robert Owen's report contains one recommendation within the closed section of his report. Honourable and right honourable members will appreciate that I cannot reveal details of that recommendation in this House, but I can assure them that the Government will respond to the Inquiry Chair on that recommendation in due course. Finally, I would like to reiterate the Government's determination to continue to seek justice for the murder of Mr. Litvinenko. I would like to repeat my thanks to Sir Robert Owen, and in particular Marina Litvinenko. As Sir Robert says in his report, she has shown dignity and composure, and has demonstrated a quiet determination to establish the true facts of her husband's death that is greatly to be commended. Mr. Litvinenko's murder was a truly terrible event. I sincerely hope that for the sake of Marina and Anatoly Litvinenko, for the sake of Mr. Litvinenko's wider family and friends, and for the sake of justice, that those responsible can be brought to trial. And I commend this statement to the House.
Mr. Andy Burnham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This, as the Home Secretary said, is one of the most shocking and disturbing reports ever presented to this Parliament. It confirms that the Russian state, at its highest level, sanctioned the killing of a British citizen.
You're watching live coverage from the House of Commons here in the UK. MPs just reacting to this British inquiry that has found that the former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by the Russian security services in an operation that was probably approved by President Putin. Now, we just heard from the Home Secretary, essentially the Interior Minister of the UK, Theresa May, and she has said that the Treasury has agreed to impose asset freezes against the 2 prime suspects in Mr. Litvinenko's murder, and that senior representations being made to the authorities in Moscow. She also said the Russian ambassador had been summoned to the Foreign Office. She was very strong in her criticism of Russia. She said this was a blatant and unacceptable breach of fundamental international law and civilized behaviour. but we have to accept that this does not come as a surprise. One other piece of reaction to bring you just in the past few minutes or so, we've heard from the office of the Prime Minister David Cameron, and he has said the conclusion that the murder was authorised at the highest levels of the Russian state is extremely disturbing. That coming from David Cameron's spokesperson. So reaction continuing to come in to this inquiry. As soon as we have more, we will bring it straight to you. I have to say, though, that the Russian Foreign Ministry has responded as well and said that the report was politically motivated and opaque. A British inquiry has concluded that Russian President Vladimir Putin probably approved the murder of former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. It found that Mr. Putin is likely to have signed off Mr. Litvinenko's poisoning with radioactive polonium, in part due to a personal antagonism between them. The judge, Sir Robert Owen, said he did not believe that the two men who carried out the killing, Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy, had any personal problem with their victim.
There is no evidence to suggest that either had any personal reason to kill Mr. Litvinenko. All the evidence points in one direction, namely that then when they killed Mr. Litvinenko, they were acting on behalf of someone else. I have concluded that there is a strong probability that when Mr. Lugovoy poisoned Mr. Litvinenko, he did so under the direction of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. I have further concluded that Mr. Kovtun was also acting under FSB direction, possibly indirectly through Mr. Lugovoy, but probably in the knowledge that that was the body for which he was acting. I have further concluded that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
Well, Mr. Litvinenko's widow, Marina, welcomed the report. She called for a travel ban on Mr. Putin and further sanctions on Russia.
I'm, of course, very pleased that the words my husband spoke on his deathbed when he accused Mr. Putin of his murder have been proved true in the English court with the highest standards of independency and fairness. But now it's time for David Cameron. I'm calling immediately for the exclusion from the UK of all Russian intelligence operatives, whether from the FSB, who murdered Sasha, or from other Russian agencies based in the London embassy. I'm also calling for the imposition of targeted economic sanctions and travel bans against named individuals, including Mr. Patrushev and Mr. Putin.
Further reaction as well in the past half hour from the British Home Secretary, Theresa May, who said the Russian ambassador had been summoned to the Foreign Office and asset freezes imposed on the two suspects in Mr. Litvinenko's murder would also be imposed.
It goes without saying that this was a blatant and unacceptable breach of the most fundamental tenets of international law and of civilized behaviour. But we have to accept this does not come as a surprise. The inquiry confirms the assessment of successive governments that this was a state-sponsored act. This assessment has informed the government's approach to date. Since 2007, that approach has comprised a series of steps to respond to Russia and its provocation. Some of these measures were immediate, such as the expulsion of a number of Russian embassy officials from the UK. Others are ongoing, such as the tightening of visa restrictions on Russian officials in the UK. The Metropolitan Police Service's investigation into Mr. Litvinenko's murder remains open, and I can tell the House today that Interpol notices and European arrest warrants are in place so that the main suspects, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, can be arrested if they travel abroad. In light of the report's findings, the government will go further, and Treasury ministers have today agreed to put in place asset freezes against the two individuals.
Theresa May there. Well, with me here in the studio is Famil Ismailov from the BBC's Russian service. What's been the official reaction in Moscow?
Well, in Moscow, Maria Zakharova, who is a spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said the inquiry was biased and the case is extremely politicized. In Moscow's view, it's a simple murder case, nothing to do with Russian authorities at all, and should have been investigated in the same way.
Andrei Lugovoy has been responding as well, one of the prime suspects. What's he said?
Well, he's saying that it's total nonsense, that he's got nothing to do with it, and he considers himself and Kovtun being victims rather than perpetrators of this murder.
Has this been closely followed, this story in Russia on state media?
It used to be, but not today. Today we had only muted kind of reports in the media. A couple of sites published some smaller reports. There were a couple of mentioning in the television on the television channels, but mostly the reaction probably will come later when we have more reaction from the authorities. That probably will be picked up by state media and brandished as that's what we think it is.
We've already heard from Theresa May talking about the asset freezes, that she's summoned the Russian ambassador. There will be no concern about that in Moscow, but how delicate is the situation now between the two countries in terms of how much London needs Moscow and how Moscow will, perhaps respond to any other moves?
Well, in terms of view in Moscow, I have to quote one of senior Russian MP who said that the relations are at such a low point at the moment. They cannot go any lower than that. The relations are still being frozen with some warming every now and then, but I have to say that there are lots of economic interests involved because the BP, the major British oil company, is involved in exploration and oil extraction in Russia, and Russia is involved in major international dilemmas concerning fighting terrorism, Islamic State, situation in Syria again, even global warming. Without Russia, lots of those issues cannot be resolved, and Russians understand that. So Moscow will try to make sure that this inquiry, that this report, doesn't spoil its standing, because it wants to be seen as a major superpower of the world, and they will have to want to see itself standing in the future as well.
Because it was interesting to hear Theresa May criticise Russia for the annexation of Crimea, for their actions in Ukraine on the one hand, quite firmly, and then on the other say, oh, but we do still need Russia. We still want to work with them when it comes to issues like Syria.
That's true. I mean, what you can do in terms of sanctions, sanctions have been introduced already, and they've been working since 2007 concerning with the Litvinenko case, and since the civil war in Ukraine, even bigger sanctions, wider sanctions on lots of individuals. I have to understand, I mean, one can see that there obviously have been people involved that have been between Mr. Patrushev, who is the head of FSB, and Lugovoy and Kovtun, who, as the investigators believe, have perpetrated the murder. But, individual sanctions are okay. Sanctions on the state in general probably won't give much results.
Very briefly, Famil, what was the motive for killing?
Well, there's famous saying in KGB that once you're a member of KGB, you never quit it in reality. That's what Mr. Putin said. Being a traitor is something that Mr. Putin hates the most. So that was a revenge to a traitor, as they see it in KGB, as a former KGB agent, and Mr. Putin is one of those, see it. So they wanted to be public suffering of an agent who went rogue.
Okay, Famil, thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome to the programme. 10 years after his death, a British inquiry has concluded that the murder of a former Russian spy on the streets of London was probably approved by President Putin. Alexander Litvinenko died after drinking poison tea. The British government said that the likely involvement of the Russian state was deeply shocking. Meanwhile, Moscow has rejected the report, saying it is politically motivated and lacking in transparency. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports.
Poisoned by radioactive polonium, And today a judge concluded Alexander Litvinenko was killed in an operation by the Russian security service, the FSB, probably authorised at the highest level.
The FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
At this central London hotel, Alexander Litvinenko drank a cup of tea laced with polonium in November 2006. Today's report says the men responsible were two Russians seen here on CCTV, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. Both deny any role. But the question at the heart of this inquiry was always why Litvinenko, seen here arriving to meet them, was killed and on whose orders. Today's report says Litvinenko was seen as an enemy of the Russian state, his image used for target practice by special forces. He'd spoken out about corruption, accused the FSB of killing innocent people, and had started working with the British intelligence service, MI6. Today's report makes clear that the Russian state was responsible for the poisoning that took place here. The question now is how the British state will respond. Today, Litvinenko's widow, Marina, called for all Russian intelligence operatives based in their London embassy to be expelled and for further steps.
I'm also calling for the imposition of targeted economic sanctions and travel bans against named individuals, including Mr. Patrushev and Mr. Putin.
The Home Secretary said the government was carefully considering the report and its implications.
The conclusion that the Russian state was probably involved in the murder of Mr. Litvinenko is deeply disturbing. It goes without saying that this was a blatant and unacceptable breach of the most fundamental tenets of international law and of civilized behaviour.
But despite the strong words, these two men, Nikolai Patrushev and Vladimir Putin, named today as probably responsible for murder, may lie beyond the reach of Britain. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
Well, a Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman has been holding a news conference. Just a moment ago, she said the controversial British investigation was criminal. Let's listen.
We have to state that the result of the 18 months of these shady games, and it's difficult to call this process any otherwise, these shady games under the chairmanship of the professional judge, all it proved to be quite expected for us. There's no innovations in the results announced. It all has become a logical conclusion of quasi-judicial process that has been staged by British court and British executive authorities, which is mildly speaking contradictory, or we could even say criminal. The objective was one and obvious from the very beginning: to shadow Russia, to blacken its leadership and official representatives.
Let's get more reaction now from Moscow and speak to our correspondent Oleg Boldarev. Oleg, we were just hearing there from a spokeswoman from the Russian Foreign Ministry. No surprises there that they've rejected this, the outcomes of this inquiry.
Yes, and it's a good example of what's coming from Moscow right now. For now, it's the second tier of Russian establishment which is speaking. And of course, both accused, Mr. Lugovoy and Mr. Kovtun, who their speeches have been so well rehearsed over the years. Lugovoy said that he's been framed, that this is politically motivated. Mr. Kovtun added a little later that any proof submitted during this inquiry has been falsified. And of course, Russian MPs are pouring scorn, taking the lead from the fact that the head of the British investigation used the word high probability. In the Russian-speaking Twitter zone, the hashtag Putin probably authorized is now gaining popularity, again mocking the results and saying that Mr. Putin probably authorized Inquisition in the Middle Ages.
Any chance then of these two being extradited to the UK is highly unlikely?
Highly unlikely, scientifically minimal. Russia's been saying all along that it will not extradite. In fact, I think the law was slightly modified back in 2007 to prohibit such extradition. Russia said it will not move Mr. Kovtun and Mr. Lugovoy to Britain.
You've spoken there about what's happening on Twitter, but is this being followed on Russian state TV?
Our TV is slightly more restrained, but again, the line is very clear. Russian media, state media, Russian politicians saying this is politically motivated process. This is not actually a real court judgment. The fact that a lot of the evidence has been taken in secrecy is further undermining the validity of it. Again, we should pay attention to the fact that the top brass of Russian officialdom has not spoken yet, maybe will not speak. This will probably mean that Moscow does not find the political measures taken by London heavy enough or damaging enough.
Relations with Russia have been at an all-time low, especially after Ukraine. I mean, what are chances now that this will impact cooperation on other issues like Syria, for example?
Well, this remains to be seen, but you are correct. One of the Russian MPs being asked whether this will damage relations basically said there is nothing to damage. They have been more or less frozen. Now Russia knows it needs to make itself indispensable over Syria, and Russia calls for cooperation over Syria. So if this channel is still open, the Russians will perhaps consider that the scandal and the next round of attention to this murder in London almost 10 years ago is now over.
Oleg, thanks so much for that update.